I'm Taya McCormick-Robo, Executive Director and CEO of Type Media Center, a dynamic media nonprofit that serves as home to a community of hundreds of journalists, authors, and truth tellers whose work aligns with a focused mission to address injustice and inequity, catalyze change, and uplift social movements. Those of you who joined us early this evening saw some of the work that Type's projects produced over the past year. From Type Investigations' dozens of high-impact, deep-diving investigations with freelance reporters to countless articles, podcasts, books, and media broadcasts by our Type fellows. We are constantly working to strengthen independent media by publishing and supporting writers and editors at every stage of their careers, offering unparalleled opportunities to take risks, to break news, and bring new ideas forward. We are so grateful you are able to join us this evening. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the war in Ukraine and its devastating consequences for Ukrainian civilians. Tragically, the latest humanitarian crisis to plague our world. But tonight we are here to celebrate the Puffin Prize for Creative Citizenship, an award co-sponsored by the Puffin Foundation and Type. I am so thrilled to honor 2021's winners, the National Network of Abortion Funds, and to have their wonderful managing director, Debasri Ghosh, here with us tonight. Coming up, you will hear from Neil Rosenstein of the Puffin Foundation, and you'll listen to an intimate discussion between three brilliant women, Debasri, Josie Duffy Rice, and Rebecca Traister, on what abortion access in the US looks like now and what we can expect in the future. So as you may know, this event serves as Type's only fundraiser each year. We are so thankful for those of you who have supported us. I want to give an extra thanks to certain sponsors. And they are Gladys Miller Rosenstein and Neil Rosenstein of the Puffin Foundation, Ken Grossinger and the Cross Currents Foundation, Conrad Martin and the Stuart R. Mott Foundation, Jeffrey and Kristen Kusama Hinty, the Schaefer family, Abby Rappaport, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, a very generous anonymous donor, David R. Jones and the Community Service Society, Randy Fertel, Davis Weinstock and Elizabeth Hawes. We all cannot thank you enough at Type. So, here to introduce this year's winner of the Puffin Prize for Creative Citizenship is my dear friend, Neil Rosenstein, president of the Puffin Foundation. Neil has been involved with the foundation since its inception. He helps oversee its grant programs, including Puffin's major initiatives in the fields of journalism and civic engagement, its annual funding of hundreds of artists and arts organizations, and the implementation of Puffin's many special projects, including its wonderful gallery for activism at the Museum of the City of New York. Neil started working as a student organizer for the New York Public Interest Research Group in 1984, where he continues as a consultant on voter participation and education efforts. So it is my great pleasure to welcome digitally Neil Rosenstein. Hi, Neil.
Thanks, Taya. I also welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to digitally share this time with you and to honor the National Network of Abortion Funds. Their efforts fighting for reproductive health and justice and to assist those seeking to access their reproductive rights is why we're recognizing their work tonight with the Puffin Prize for Creative Citizenship. Let's face it, we live in very difficult and challenging times. We've got rising threats to our democracy at home, senseless wars, a climate catastrophe in the making, and the rights of many jeopardized, oppressed, and suppressed at home and abroad. But lost in the headlines, there are also countless unsung heroes like NNAF that are fighting to improve their communities and to protect the rights of others. The Puffin Prize recognizes those struggles and accomplishments with an award of $100,000 for the recipient in honor of their work. Created by Puffin's founder, my father Perry, the prize starts its third decade tonight. But another part of his goals for the prize was to bring attention to the efforts of the honorees in the media, like to thank Type, and to foster ties between honorees like NNAF that could bring attention to further attention of their work and to encourage relationships that might advance their efforts. In that spirit, I'm very pleased that we're going to hear from last year's prize winner recipient, Desmond Meade. Desmond is helping to explode the myth that we live in a fully functional democracy. That is, and it's always been, a fiction. Our country's history has been an ongoing struggle of the rights of poor, of women, of BIPOC and youth, and so many other to be equal participants in our democracy. Desmond's grassroots work and success helped expose Florida's shameless election system and reverse the unjust denial and the rights of many returning citizens at the ballot box. And much like NNAF, much of his work focuses on individuals. I'm really looking forward to hearing from him tonight Desmond's work is truly inspirational.
Hello, everyone. My name is Desmond Meade. I am the Executive Director of Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and the 2020 recipient of the Puffin Prize. I'd first like to congratulate this year's recipient, National Network of Abortion Funds, for receiving such a prestigious honor. With the Puffin Prize, I was able to advance the work that we were doing in Florida around fines and fees. My organization led the effort to restore voting rights to 1.4 million people with previous felony convictions. But because of legislative action, there was a requirement to pay outstanding fines and fees before people were able to register. Of course, we engaged in a campaign to raise significant amount of money to help people pay off these fines and fees, because we believe that no American citizen should be forced to choose between putting food on their table or being able to vote. I was able to take a very significant portion of the Puffin Prize cash award and put it up as a matching fund, where we were able to actually raise 3 times the amount that was put up. And those monies were then used to help a significant number of people be able to have a pathway to register to vote and participate in the 2020 election. Let me tell you the story of Barbara. Barbara was a young woman who thought for 24 years that she would never be able to vote again. But because of our fines and fees fund and how we were able to implement it, she had the opportunity to vote. And as she was registering to vote, with tears streaming down her eyes, she asked that we pray that God would allow her to live long enough to be able to cast a vote. You see, what we didn't know at the time was, prior to us encountering Barbara, her doctor gave her 6 months to live. And what struck me most about that situation was, here you had an individual who had 6 months to live, and her dying wish was not to meet a celebrity or to visit an exotic location, but rather her dying wish was to get what it feels like to be an American citizen, what it felt like to be able to participate in democracy. I share that story because sometimes we can get caught up in the numbers or the figures or the amount of money that is being used, and lose sight of the fact that what we fight for, right, has no numerical value, that it is much deeper. Because I ask people today, what was the value of Barbara's desire to participate in our democracy? And so I am very excited for this year's winner, because I know that receiving the Puffin Prize would allow you to touch so many more people's lives, and it would have such an exponential value in the work that you're doing that far exceeds the prize amount that you're going to receive. So Godspeed, good luck, and continue your great work, right? And once again, congratulations.
I want to thank Desmond for his thoughts. In just over a minute, we're going to see another wonderful video, this one produced for NNAF and featured on their homepage. I think we all realize that the impact of the arts and artists commenting on contemporary issues can't be understated. From Picasso's Guernica to those incredibly powerful and horrifying pictures of the My Lai massacre in Kent State, from Diego Rivera's huge murals to editorial cartoonists that day after day ridicule the powerful and their policies in a single frame. From the racism embodied by Birth of a Nation to that first interracial TV kiss between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhuru, it's clear that arts and artists have a populous path into the hearts and into the minds of the public. So we're fortunate now to share this powerful and this affirming video. It features the illustrations of investigative journalist and artist Molly Crabapple, and it demonstrates the power of art. In this case, making connections and fostering understanding of abortion and the important work, mission, and motivations of NNAF.
It's time to change the conversation about abortion, to make it a real option, available to all people without shame or judgment. We all love someone who has had an abortion, whether we know it or not. All of our lives are affected by abortion access. Organizations like the National Network of Abortion Funds are helping people all over the country to access and fund abortions. The National Network of Abortion Funds believes that compassion is a radical act and that love and acceptance are part of activism. Abortion funds offer support in many ways. They might provide information, money, travel planning, and accommodations, accompaniment, or emotional support. People working or volunteering with an abortion fund might offer rides to clinics, a place to stay, meals, a hot shower, a change of clothes, childcare, or a hand to hold. Abortion funds are fighting to ensure everyone has the power and resources to decide if, when, and how to grow their families. Together, we can take the stigma and shame out of abortion and shift our vision to be one of radical love that supports all people in making decisions for their bodies and lives in freedom.
Wow. 11 years ago, Cecile Richards, the president of Planned Parenthood, was the recipient of this award for her defense of reproductive rights in the face of unrelenting attacks, and for her efforts to actually help expand access to reproductive health care in the Affordable Care Act. But the slow poisoning of many of America's courts and state houses has been chipping away at reproductive rights for a long time. And the Supreme Court, as just about everyone knows, is set to weigh in on the very constitutionality of Roe versus Wade. Across the country, the right to an abortion is under attack, with BIPOC and those of low income bearing the brunt of draconian and barbaric restrictions designed to deny safe, timely, and legal access, even in the case of rape. There seems to be no shortage of self-serving politicians, pundits, and religious zealots pushing these measures across the country. Yet, even in the face of threats, legislative intimidation, and violence, committed doctors, medical professionals, and clinics continue to provide abortion services. But even when abortion is legal, or perhaps within a day's drive to a neighboring state, it simply may not be possible or feasible for someone who's pregnant to access those services. Food, travel, lodging, childcare, missing work with the risk of being fired, as well as a lack of information on where and how to locate trusted abortion services are among the many barriers that those who can still technically access a legal abortion may face. Don't expect your health insurance, if you have health insurance, to cover those expenses. Don't count on your place of worship or for your employer to chip in either. Simply put, far too many of those seeking abortions simply can't afford access for those services. That is where the National Network of Abortion Funds comes in. Now, they may sound like a single entity, but NNAF is actually a collection of more than 90 organizations that will assist those in financial need and who are pushing for reforms and against deforms at the local, regional, and national level. Their mission statement spells it out. The National Network of Abortion Funds builds power with members to remove financial and logistical barriers to abortion access by centering people who have abortions and organizing at the intersections of racial, economic, and reproductive justice. You know, we have a fantastic discussion coming up, but now I have the distinct privilege to introduce NNAF's Managing Director, Debasri Ghosh, to the stage to accept the Puffin Prize for Creative Citizenship.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you to the Puffin Foundation and Type Media Center for this incredible award, the 2021 Puffin Prize for Creative Citizenship for the National Network of Abortion Funds for their tireless advocacy and efforts to remove the personal, financial, and logistical barriers to abortion access. I can't tell you how meaningful it is to be honored with this award among such luminaries as Desmond Meade and so many other giants in our interconnected movements for justice. I feel a particular kinship for Desmond's work with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition as a fellow organization that moves money to people disenfranchised by systemic oppression so that they can live with dignity. There has never been a time like this in reproductive health, rights, and justice. We have been bombarded with abortion bans, laws that shut down clinics, funding restrictions, all part of a national coordinated strategy to criminalize and push abortion out of reach for hundreds of thousands of us, disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, queer and trans communities, those with disabilities, immigrants, young people, and others who have been pushed to the margins of power. Beyond the laws and policies, the cultural stigma and vitriol thrown at people who have abortions is overwhelming. Abortion funders deal with this harassment, intimidation, death threats sometimes daily. It is all too much. And yet every day, abortion fund staff and volunteers show up for their communities. They organize their resources and answer the call of their neighbors who are facing impossible decisions. Should I put this $100 towards my abortion, or should I pay my heating bill? How am I going to get to a clinic 100 miles away? And who's going to watch my kids? Who can I talk to when I feel so much shame about wanting an abortion? These are the kinds of questions that abortion funders hear every day, and every day they continue to show up with compassion, grace, affirmation, and what I like to call a healthy dose of logistical magic. They answer those calls, they pay for abortions, and they also tell people in no uncertain terms, this is not your fault. Not being able to afford your abortion is not a personal shortcoming. It is a systemic failure. Abortion funds live at this intersection of organizing, philanthropy, community care, mutual aid, and culture change. It's such a radical model for how we can care for each other. And of course, this work is made possible by the individuals and organizations like the Puffin Foundation who support us, who take a stand and say, when the government fails to provide a social safety net for us, we'll do the damn thing ourselves. We shouldn't have to, but we do. And we're so heartened by the support and spotlight that you all are shining on us. It means the world to be seen and valued in this way. And so I am honored to accept this award on behalf of the 93 member organizations in the National Network of Abortion Funds, the thousands of abortion funders who do this work rigorously in service of a vision for a world in which every reproductive decision, including abortion, takes place in thriving communities that are safe, peaceful, and affordable, and where all people have the power and resources to care for and affirm our bodies, identities, and health. Thank you so much to the Puffin Foundation and Type Media Center for uplifting abortion funds and moving in solidarity with us.
Congratulations, Debasri, and your team at NNAF. We are so honored to give you this award this evening, and thank you. So now I'm pleased to turn the virtual stage over to one of my favorite people, Josie Duffy Rice. She is a fellow at Type, but she's also an incredibly accomplished and busy lawyer, writer, journalist, podcast host, screenwriter, and more. Josie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Taya. As one of my favorite people, I am very glad we're on the same page about that. I am truly overjoyed to be back for Type's Puffin Prize celebration for this is my third year. 2020's conversation with Desmond Meade of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and John Legend on voting rights was incredible, and I'm sure tonight's conversation will just be equally special. And I am truly Type Media's biggest fan on earth. So doing anything for this organization and these incredible people is an honor. So thank you. So please stay tuned for the discussion and feel free to drop your own questions into the chat. So now I'm so pleased to be sharing my screen for a conversation with Debasri and fellow journalist Rebecca Traister. So Debasri, as you have just heard from Neil, is the managing director of the National Network of Abortion Funds. Debasri has worked with the National Network of Abortion Funds since 2015. She's also a board member of the Women's Medical Fund and a past board member of Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania and the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women. As managing director since 2021, Debasri has coordinated, should I say NNAF? Is there a better way to say it? Okay, NNAF's collection of 90 independently run abortion support groups, which, acting like a middleman, NNAF kind of works at the intersection of local abortion fund groups, their members and donors to remove financial and logistical barriers to abortion access by centering people who have abortions and organizing at the intersections of racial, economic, and reproductive justice. I am also honored to be joined by Rebecca Traister, a writer at large for New York Magazine, a National Magazine Award winner. She has written about women in politics, media, and entertainment from a feminist perspective for The New Republic and Salon, and has also contributed to The Nation, The New York Observer, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. She's the author of 2019's incredible book, Good and Mad, and 2016's also incredible book, All the Single Ladies, both New York Times bestsellers, and the award-winning Big Girls Don't Cry. It's hard to explain just how incredible Rebecca is and the impact her work has had on me personally, but I'll put it this way. When my husband, who's now one of Rebecca's colleagues, got a job at New York Magazine, the first thing I said was, "Oh my God, you're going to work with Rebecca Traister." So I'm so glad that you're both joining me now. Debasri and Rebecca, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. It's an honor.
So I wanted to start by getting a little bit of history. So Debasri, as we know, access to abortion and reproductive health care in America has become increasingly challenging over the past few years. And so as much as possible, can you kind of give us a pretty brief overview of where the US currently stands in regard to abortion access and how Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization came to be argued in front of the Supreme Court recently?
Absolutely. It's such an honor to be here in conversation with you both. I'm a big fan of your work. I want to start by talking a little bit about the history of Roe v. Wade. There's a lot of focus on it right now, as it should be. In January, we commemorated the 49th anniversary of Roe. And it struck me personally that we probably won't get to see the 50th anniversary. And I know that probably feels like a punch in the gut to everyone in this digital room. But I think it's important to talk about the histories and the stories of Roe and how they've impacted our movements, particularly the stories that haven't been told as much in common narrative. So there is this longstanding myth that the Roe v. Wade decision was the catalyst for the anti-abortion movement. That, in 1973, Roe, mobilized so many evangelicals who are morally outraged that they, got their base together to overturn it. And while it's true that in, the years following that, Roe did set off a chain of events, including the passage of the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal funding for being used for abortion, the anti-abortion movement didn't really take off right away. In fact, there were many conservative leaders, Baptist leaders who praised Roe throughout the 70s. It wasn't until 1979, 1978, so 6 or 7 years after Roe, that evangelical leaders who had been kind of lacking political voice and power for decades took on abortion, not for moral reasons, but for political ones, as a rallying cry to defeat Carter and elect Reagan. And, it was very strategic. They saw that a crusade against abortion was a lot more palatable than the religious right's real motive, which was protecting segregated schools. There was a controversy at the time about Bob Jones University and its refusal to admit Black students. So I name this because I think it's important to be explicit that the roots of the anti-abortion movement were in protecting racial segregation and building a white supremacist religious right, the so-called moral majority. And how that history of denying abortion access is so closely tied to structural racism, how that compels us in our movements to protect and expand abortion access have to be integrated with movements for racial justice, dismantling anti-Blackness, really moving forward a truly intersectional agenda. So, if you look at the decades of abortion politics and culture following that, you'll see there has been this systematic erosion of our human right to control our pregnancies. And especially in the last 10 years or so, there's been a sharp uptick in anti-abortion restrictions moving through state legislatures, devoted to a variety of different prongs, shutting down clinics, imposing medically unnecessary and harmful barriers, criminalizing people who have abortions. And I think that is what led us to where we are now, with the Supreme Court soon to rule on the viability of the Mississippi ban on abortion at 15 weeks, widely considered pre-viability, and is likely to open up the floodgates of criminalizing abortion in nearly half the states in this country. And then at the same time, we're seeing this uptick in abortion bans like the one passed in Texas, which not only bans abortion at 6 weeks before most people know that they are pregnant, but also essentially deputizes community members to police each other's reproductive decisions by empowering them to sue abortion providers or anyone who helps someone get an abortion. And we're seeing these, sort of copycat bills with this kind of language, this new enforcement mechanism popping up all across the country in different state legislatures in Florida and Ohio, et cetera. So there are some very significant threats on the horizon. We do always say that, abortion funds have been navigating a low access landscape for decades. It's what we started with, and it's what we have been preparing for, even with Roe in place. As Neil mentioned, abortion access has never been a promise for so many people who have been denied funding and coverage. So we believe we were made for this moment, and we are ready to invite even more people in, because the time is now. If there was ever a time where you thought abortion access is cool, I'm glad that people can get abortions. Now's the time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I want to talk about what you just brought up about these laws that kind of deputize average citizens. But first, I want to ask if you can give a brief summary about what local and state abortion funds do, in addition to providing funding for patients without financial resources. Do they cover expenses beyond direct medical costs or provide counseling and other services? What can you explain just the kind of broad picture of what they help fund?
Yeah, absolutely. So funding abortion is our bread and butter in many cases because of the Hyde Amendment and the abortion funding bans on private and public and private insurance, including, Medicaid enrollees, government employees, military families. Providing funding for the procedure, for the medication is the primary resource that abortion funds have historically provided. In the last 5-7 years, I would say there's been an expansion of those services, mostly because of the increase in TRAP laws designed to shut down clinics, which have been so successful. I mean, just really overwhelmingly successful. Most people don't live near an abortion provider. 90% of counties in the US don't have an abortion provider. So more and more people are traveling hundreds of miles, traveling across state lines. So abortion funds are increasingly in the business of the suite of sort of holistic services outside of funding for the abortion procedure or medication. And we call that practical support. So transportation, rides, paying for plane fare, train fare, et cetera. Lodging as well. So one of the more insidious anti-abortion restrictions are these mandatory waiting periods for what is a very common and safe procedure, where you may have to stay by the clinic for 2 to sometimes even 5 days. So multiple visits over several days. So, if you think about what that means in terms of the costs that you incur, both personally, like having to stay somewhere, food, all of that, as well as the costs that are incurring back home, right? So abortion funds often support with things like back wages. We're paying for childcare. Most of the people who have abortions, who call abortion funds, are parents already. So, it kind of balloons into this need for wraparound supports related to travel and associated expenses. And then there are other needs that I think are really beautiful and framed within our compassionate stance. We often offer abortion doula services, interpretation. We have one fund member called Jane's Due Process that supports young people who are navigating parental consent laws. So they provide legal support and representation to young people who are going through the judicial bypass process, essentially trying to bypass forced parental involvement in their abortions. So I would say that the offerings of direct service is getting wider as the barriers are getting more complex. Aside from that, a number of funds are also doing organizing and movement building work. So this is everything from policy advocacy to culture change. Abortion funds are often the first voice that people talk to about wanting to end their pregnancy. So there's this direct line, right, with people who are on the front lines of these barriers. And we really work to build the leadership of those people calling funds. We work on local and state level advocacy campaigns. We put up billboards, destigmatizing abortion, normalizing abortion. And of course, our base comprises a huge swath of the grassroots base to enact sweeping federal change, like repealing the Hyde Amendment. So I think that is the shortest answer
Yeah,
I can give.
no, that's incredible. I mean, I think you highlight exactly what we know, right? Which is that abortion funds are doing all kinds of incredible work and creating community in places, and in a particularly isolating situation for so many people. So I'm very grateful for you laying it all out like that. Rebecca, I wanted to ask you about what we're seeing kind of across the country right now. So the right has been attempting to unravel abortion rights for decades. If you ever want to see creative legal arguments, you just look at how the right has tried to make a constitutional right unconstitutional in various ways for so long. And recently, we've seen these laws that Debasri brought up earlier that literally deputize regular citizens as functionally law enforcement, right? Giving them the power to punish people for exercising their reproductive rights. I wonder how this moment is shaping your work, how your role as someone whose job it is to kind of translate the intensity and the seriousness of this fight meet a moment like this, and how you're seeing this kind of current legal slate of new laws and potentially more that really not only seek to impact abortion rights, but all rights if we start deputizing regular citizens to just enforce the law.
So that's a fascinating question, and it has a couple of different answers, because on the one hand, there's the actual form of these laws, which work as models. And Debasri brought up the fleet of so-called trap laws, right? And we could see how that model, which was basically made up medical idea, like non-scientific, invented, fantasized rules about how wide a hallway corridor had to be, right? As a way to enact state restrictions that essentially just made abortion inaccessible, and especially inaccessible to the most vulnerable people who needed abortion care. But they worked, and so they proliferated. And you could see how quickly that model became incredibly powerful in states around the country. And I think that what you're seeing with this Texas law is a model that we can already see how it's been repeated in just this past week's news about the law that deputized Texans to turn in parents who were being supportive parents of trans children, right? That is a similar model, and so I think you can see this as this law has already just become successful, you're going to see it repeated in so many different forms. And it's a way to bypass the courts, of course, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. We're seeing a new and very perilous, very dangerous model for ways that forces that want to restrict liberty and dignity it's a new path for them to do it. Mm-hmm. So that's very scary. The second thing, your question about how this moment impacts the kind of work that I do, the thing that I think about as somebody who's been writing about these issues for a long time at this point, is it's one of these moments where people who for a long time didn't take a lot of this seriously enough are suddenly, as you said, being punched, or Debasri said, punched in the gut by the probability that Roe is not going to live to see its 50th birthday, right?
Right.
And it's sort of a fascinating moment to have been engaged in these arguments and these issues over decades. I guess for me at this point, it's been decades professionally, because for so much of that time, to be forecasting this, predicting it, saying this is what's going to happen, this is going to be the results if we don't strategize, if the party that is supposed to be the steward of these rights doesn't strategize better at state and local levels, doesn't take it seriously in terms of the judiciary choices, doesn't take it seriously in terms of who we care about electing, talking about it as a looming threat and a reality, right? If we don't do better, this is going to happen. And for years, those arguments were dismissed as hysterical, literally hysterical. People who were arguing this, who were doing the work, were treated as fantasists. And I think that gets back to a history. Debasri walked us so capably through the history of how the right began to organize so efficiently and effectively, really building in the late 70s. And again, doing this kind of organizing at state legislative levels, school boards, creating a judicial pipeline to ensure that judges over decades, and those judges are now sitting, of course, on the Supreme Court and are going to be the ones who are in a position to end Roe this summer. That kind of strategizing over decades has been happening against, I want to give the twin history of that. After the civil rights and women's movements that produced such sort of eruptive change, the Democratic Party became the steward of those rights, charged with theoretically protecting them and continuing to fight for them. And as we know, and this is true certainly for voting rights, for labor rights, and for reproductive rights and access, unfortunately, there was a lot of inattention to those, beginning for the Democratic Party in the late 70s too, with the passage of Hyde, which is the legislative rider that prevented anyone using federal insurance money to use it for paying for necessary abortion care. And Democrats, many Democrats, first of all, supported Hyde. In 1977, the Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, when asked whether Hyde was unfair, said lots of things in life are unfair. As recently as, the Barack Obama administration, Barack Obama, who officially opposed Hyde, also referred to it as a tradition. You had a Democratic Party that was unwilling to take seriously the impact of Hyde, which was that people who needed abortions, who were poor, from poor communities, Black and brown communities, immigrant communities, rural communities, people who were young, did not have access to this legal procedure. And there was a kind of hiding behind the idea, well, Roe stands, even as Hyde and state restrictions were eroding access. Roe might as well not have existed. This is why Debasri's work and the work of abortion funds has been so crucial over decades, because people could not get abortions that they needed and that they legally had a right to get as part of healthcare. And that all happened under the watch of a Democratic Party that kept arguing about how we should have a bigger tent and we shouldn't make this a litmus test. And people who were screaming about abortion were single issue voters who were hurting a larger progressive project. And that's been the backdrop for so much of my work as a journalist writing about these things, and hearing them called hysterical. And there has been a kind of comfort, especially from a class that tends to produce a lot of politicians and a lot of media, a white middle upper class, where Roe worked to protect the right to an abortion, and therefore the fact that human beings were not able to get the care that they had a right to didn't seem pressing.
Yeah, it was
and
a personal fault.
Roe is going to shock that class into consciousness about this stuff. But it's been a reality on the ground. I mean, these are decades in which we know, Debasri's talked about this, abortion clinics have been bombed, abortion providers have been murdered in churches. These things have been happening in the same period in which, I know I have been told by my own colleagues in the purportedly, liberal media, that to be upset and to predict a future in which Roe is gutted or overturned is hysterical. And those are words that have been used. And now it's not going to be hysterical, but of course we're now also at a point where so many of the things we could have done to avert it,
right,
those moments have passed. Right.
I mean, people would have probably called this hysterical less than a year ago, right? I mean, it wasn't until this how we've seen the court change in a very predictable but quick way, right? Many people didn't want to believe that this was going to happen.
And Democratic leaders, remember, just from the last few court appointments, right? From the Amy Coney,
Right.
Brett Kavanaugh, Gorsuch. Democrats did not fight on abortion. They made a conscious choice. You had individual leaders who were very clear to the media that this was going to end Roe. But as a group, there was not a sustained or strategic willingness. There was a decision not to fight, not to make the fights on those nominees about abortion, because the Democratic Party absorbed a fundamentally regressive right-wing framework in which abortion is something icky.
Shameful, right?
Yes, and and they repeat that. I mean, the left is just as guilty of having reinforced that as the right. And so there's been an unwillingness to have these fights, even though polling tells us over and over again, once you get the good polling, that support for legal abortion is among the most popular planks in a Democratic platform. Still, there has been an unwillingness to fight for that issue and to make it clear and direct and unapologetic. And that's been a major strategic problem for Democrats. And it has also, by the way, prevented the party from doing the kind of organizing that's going to be necessary going forward. Because if you look at the history of how anti-abortion right-wing forces got to this point of victory, it is through decades of starting at school boards and planning judiciary. Those roads will have to be begun anew, and I think are, but that's decades of work, because in a failure to take this threat seriously, and in a failure to take seriously the actual harm being done every day over decades via Hyde and these state restrictions, Democrats haven't been strategizing about how to fix this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Rebecca. Yes, I could not agree more. I want to remind people to send questions in, so we'll hopefully have time for a few at the end of this conversation, but also maybe not, because I have a lot of questions that I want to ask. But no, please send questions in. We'd love to answer them. I want to talk to both of you about what we're seeing right now across the country. So we talked a little bit about this idea of deputizing average citizens. We are talking about what's coming up in Jackson with the Supreme Court, but we know that there are other tactics that abortion opponents in Texas and elsewhere are using to intimidate and discourage women from accessing reproductive health care. So I think one of the ones that Rebecca just highlighted is kind of the doing by not doing, which seems to be kind of the pattern of the Democratic Party. But can you all talk about what else is happening, what else we're seeing, and the other ways in which we're keeping women from accessing full control of their own healthcare?
Sure, I can get us started. I mean, there's a litany where to begin. I mean, beside the very concerted effort to eliminate providers from the landscape, I think there are these really very creative tactics to confuse and obfuscate the issue of abortion access. So I think it's 18 states mandate counseling to abortion patients, and their mandated counseling is factually inaccurate. I've talked to providers who say, when I meet with a patient before their abortion, I say, I'm legally mandated by the state to read this statement. It is lies. And it talks about, the purported link between abortion and breast cancer does not exist. There's no scientific evidence. So, I think there are these ways that we're codifying lying to patients and to the general public about the safety and necessity of abortion. There's also this side project of crisis pregnancy centers, which we like to think of them as like the anti-abortion funds. They're essentially fake clinics that are run by and funded through anti-abortion, forces, in which patients are targeted, pregnant patients are targeted and tricked into believing that they are abortion clinics, and they're, welcomed in and then fed complete misinformation, given unnecessary ultrasounds, told that abortion causes harm, told that it's too late to get an abortion. They're not staffed by medical professionals, and these are very well-funded operations. They're sometimes funded by government funding sources. So I think there's, sort of this like cultural strain of pressure. And then, we at NNAF, we see abortion access as very connected to larger struggles for economic justice and anti-criminalization. We see the criminalization of abortion as part of a larger effort to apply a carceral lens to pregnancy, to trans identity, as Rebecca mentioned, to disabled people's rights to exist. So there's this really toxic effort to blur the lines of sites of medical care and sites of criminalization. So we've seen this, the shackling of incarcerated women giving birth, seen it in cases where women of color have been arrested for having miscarriages at home because they've been accused of self-managing their abortions. We've seen laws targeting pregnant people using drugs. And of course, this most impacts communities of colors and folks who, who cross over these different identity axes. So, I think these are some of the most insidious ways that we are narrowing the lane for abortion access.
Yeah,
I think it's really important what Debasri just talked about in terms of the mingling of an anti-abortion movement with a carceral enthusiasm, right, that is unabated in this country. One of the things that I think is unclear for people who are just sort of coming to consciousness about how real this is right now, there was a sense in advance of Roe that it was almost a paternalistic lens in which the women themselves were not necessarily vilified, right, by anti-abortion forces. Their doctors were, but and the moral argument about what the risks were if abortion remained illegal was the women, the people who died with unsafe, illegal abortions. That's why the coat hanger became such a potent symbol. Images of women who had died and been sterilized were part of the moral argument. Looking into a future of illegal abortion where there absolutely will be that kind of medical and medical peril, especially for those who have to wait deeper and deeper into their pregnancies before they can even access any kind of care. But the other thing that I think people haven't totally absorbed is that the future is incarcerating abortion seekers, and that is already happening. There are people who have been jailed after miscarriages, jailed in the death of fetuses, and that I don't know that there's yet a full consciousness of how that is going to be a punitive recourse in a world in which the nature of abortion has changed slightly medically, because there is now medication abortion that makes some of the actual procedures very different than they were decades ago. But certainly incarceration is part of this future.
Yeah. I mean, I keep thinking about this kind of burgeoning parent rights movement that seems to center mostly around CRT, critical race theory, and masks, et cetera, that doesn't actually seem to be translating to a broader population about, what these new laws and what this future means for parents, that you will be overly criminalized from the minute, you are pregnant throughout being a parent, throughout childhood, and that is the nature of what we are seeing on the reproductive health future. So speaking right to the things that keep me up at night, and I know you all as well. Debasri, I wanted to talk a little bit about the practicality of your work. So can you talk to us about whether funding for the services have kind of fluctuated according to what's in the news cycle? What are you seeing now? How does that kind of hinder your work? And then Also, what you are kind of expecting in this nearish future, right? The next couple of years about increased demand for your services, increased expenses, and how you plan to kind of meet that.
The $10 million question.
I know.
We've seen the public profile of abortion funds grow over the last few years, starting with the 2016 election, the wave of abortion bans that sort of rolled through Alabama and Georgia and the South a few years ago. And of course, the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh and then Amy Coney Barrett. So we are accustomed to these news cycles that, create these spikes in donations and interest. And we're really grateful to be on the radar and to welcome new folks into our network. I think what I really always try to express is that this fight, it's a long game. Like, it's not going away anytime soon. It's about so much more than one bill here, one bill there. The damage that's being done to the abortion access infrastructure, it's going to take decades, maybe generations to restore. And we haven't even hit the bottom yet. So I don't say that to be bleak. I say that as, a plea and an invitation. I think about this as a parent, I think about this often, like, what are we leaving? What legacy, what conditions are we leaving our children? And not just about abortion rights and reproductive health, but about climate collapse, about civil rights. Like, how are we setting up future generations to survive and thrive? And I want to be able to tell my children that we fought for them, that we fought for their liberation, their freedom, their inclusion, their justice. And I think this is, everyone's so sick of hearing the word unprecedented, and I am too. I would love to not be in an unprecedented this time.
I would love some precedent. Yeah.
I would love some precedent. So delightful. But truly, if this isn't a moment, a time that we're living through to activate us across so many axes, then what time is there? So, we are working to scale abortion funds, to build up the infrastructure on the ground, obviously to get more dollars to the ground. I think we need that. And we're still very invested in the long-term legislative and political battles. We're not at all divesting from that. But in the meantime, I think what we have learned in the last couple of years with the pandemic is that people are ready to take care of each other. We have the capacity to build our own infrastructure, to, weave together a plan and to move money to communities, to our own communities and to communities that we're aligned with, that we're connected with. So that, that call to action, I hope is very powerful right now, because it's going to be a long time before we see the kinds of protections that, as Rebecca mentioned, many have become accustomed to. And we need to create alternative economies to be able to ensure that people have access to abortion and to be able to exercise bodily autonomy more broadly. I think abortion has unfairly and problematically been exceptionalized in many ways. And we're reaching the end of that. Abortion is the catalyst, and it's such a shame. Rebecca mentioned that it has been so sidelined and stigmatized in political discussions over the course of the last several decades, because it is seen as this, this issue over here. It was the sacrificial lamb of the Affordable Care Act. It's the wedge issue. It's the litmus test, and all this language, this narrative about abortion just makes it seem like it's this one thing, but it's really not. When you take away someone's right to create family in the ways that they so choose, you're really setting yourself up for a society that doesn't really have any ability to control our lives, our communities, our bodies, our decisions.
Absolutely. I want to ask a question that we got from the audience, and I am already letting you all know I am kidnapping you and keeping you here for hours to answer my questions, because this is such a great conversation. I have so much I want to talk about. I actually will not kidnap you. I can't. It's via Zoom, but I will, theoretically. We had a great question, which I think gets a little bit more articulately as to what has been concerning me these past few months. How do we respond to what we're seeing right now, which is this kind of appropriation by anti-vaxxers of this time-honored reproductive rights slogan, "My body, my choice"? This question is from Robert Schaffer. Rebecca, I'll start with you, since you are, work as someone who kind of is trying to translate ideas to the broader public in that way. What do you do with something like this, where really it's about messaging and narrative, and it seems to be sticking with some people?
So I think there are a couple things, and I don't know that I have a great coherent answer to this, right? If there were an easy answer, like surely somebody would have dealt with it already, but I think it brings up a bunch of things that I think about all the time. Okay, so one is that a lot of these arguments are very flexible and can be applied. This is true even, look at periods in which right-wing, women have very, 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 like behind incredibly misogynistic, racist policy, adopt the language of feminism and civil rights, right? To, you see that in this happens all the time. The sort of the taking on of the language and framework pioneered by, progressive organizing, progressive activism to mask or pretty up fundamentally regressive ideas and policy. So that's always a risk, right? I always people always like play with this, like, do you get to be a feminist or whatever? Like, whoever fights hard enough gets to have the mantle, right? It's not actually about I got the language, therefore I win. No, you win the language and you win the argument by committing yourself to it, often, as Debasri said, and I think it's so crucial, over a period of lifetime and generations, right? And committed work, understanding that a lot of that work is going to be losing, right? So first of all, we have to up that we can't just rear back from the appropriation of language to mean its opposite, because that happens all the time. It's a tool in an ideological fight, right? The second thing is that my body, my choice is powerful in a lot of ways. But I do think that one of the things I keep encountering in this period, and certainly as I think about the lessons that I've learned from the reproductive justice movement, as opposed to what we think of as the reproductive rights or pro-choice movement, is that so much of what we have, especially again, a white middle class that so often controls political debate, terms of political debate and media, we cling to frameworks and arguments that privilege the individual and the self and ourselves over community engagement. And so I don't want to take away from the power of my body, my choice, right? Like I don't, it's incredibly powerful and real. But it is also true that we have sacrificed the engagement with community. Like, yes, it's about, sure, me, but a lot of the things we're fighting for here should be and are about the protections, dignity, well-being, economic solidity and stability of those around us, right? Medical, emotional, these, and so much of what has been clear through the COVID fights over the past couple of years is an absolute abdication of community responsibility, right? So I say this not to attack the My Body, My Choice framework. I think it's very valuable. It makes a strong point. We often do have to appeal to people's self-interest, right? And that self-interest is real, right? But I don't mean to take away from it, but I think we also need to be additive in terms of how we're making these arguments and point out that these, and that is the thing that the reproductive justice movement has been so good at, is that somehow a Democratic Party, and to some extent a pro-choice movement that is in one way not talked openly about abortion, right, uses euphemism like choice, right? And Joe Biden didn't even say the word abortion last night in the State of the Union at the moment that abortion is about to be made illegal. But at the same time has not pointed out how interconnected all these issues are. And that's what the reproductive justice movement has been so brilliant about, in understanding that you can't even get to choices if you don't have choices about abortion or about reproductive decisions, whether, if, under what circumstances to have a family or what kind of family that's going to be, if you're not also addressing affordable housing, incarceration, education, better labor laws, all these kinds of, this massive suite of interconnected policies that make
Mm.
those choices possible. So I think we need to not, instead of fight hard for the ideas that we believe in, be willing to be out there and commit yourself to fighting for the language that makes sense to you. But secondly, look to broaden the language and the thinking about why these are moral responsibilities and obligations beyond ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Do you want to add anything to that question?
I think Rebecca covers it beautifully. I just think it's not apples to apples at all. Your decision to get an abortion or to have access to one has no bearing on really anyone outside of you and your family. And your decision to get vaccinated, to wear a mask, that impacts everyone. It's a ripple effect. So I think it's a bit of a straw man argument, to be honest. I don't think,
Definitely.
I think it's a consequence of some messaging frames that have not been successful over the course of the last several decades. And I think it speaks, more than anything, not about abortion, but just about like our lack of muscle as it relates to having like collective and community care for one another. It's just not in our lexicon. And I think with, Roe falling, with whatever is next with the pandemic, we have to build that muscle, and we can have these rhetorical debates, but they're not to freedom.
Yes, absolutely. So unfortunately, somehow we've already talked for our allotted time, even though I have so many more things to ask you. So I'm going to ask you all one more question. But I want to know what is giving you hope. What are the positive signs that you see on the horizon? How can we not be increasingly despairing? Because what I'm hearing both of you say is that, things are, we're in a tough place, but that this isn't the end of the fight, right? This is a long fight. And Debasri, as you brought up about parenting, which I think both Rebecca and I really, we both reacted to your point about what are we leaving for our kids, letting them know we're fighting for you. What about the younger generation and their view of access? And, how do we look towards the future?
It's such a great question. I think about this quote from Mariam Kaba, let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. And it's become a bit of a mantra for our work. So many of the anti-abortion strategies are meant to wear us down emotionally, psychologically, physically, and we just can't let it happen. It just, we have to keep fighting. If not, then what, why do we show up every day for our communities and for our families? And so, I find strength in the wins that we have had that have been significant. There's been some amazing organizing happening at local levels. The city councils in New York and in Austin, Texas passed ordinances that allotted public funding from their city budgets to cover abortions. Just, like really radical stuff happening on the local levels. Illinois repealed its forced parental involvement law last fall after, again, years of grassroots organizing. And culturally, people are talking more publicly about abortion and talking differently about abortion. People are sharing their abortion stories. People are saying abortion instead of couching it in the euphemistic language of choice or, whatever has been the dominant way of talking about abortion in the past. And, I think I am obsessed with Gen Z. I really trust that they can see beyond a lot of the nebulousness that my generation has gotten caught in. And I appreciate Rebecca bringing the reproductive justice framework into the room, because I think it actually is what is going to lead us to freedom and liberation. I think, following the lead of Black organizers, Black women who have been talking since the 90s about this being about more than the right to end a pregnancy. It's the right to have the families that we desire, to raise them in safe, healthy communities that allows us to connect the dots between this movement for abortion access with so many other movements, right? Our communities deserve access to clean air, to, have healthy, safe pregnancies free from toxic pollutants in cities, deserve access to safe, communities to be able to send kids to school without fear of being gunned down by the police. These are all movements that are gaining such power and steam right now. And it's exciting to see, I think the younger generation more than ever has grown up with a really intersectional view and analysis and sees it much more clearly than I did when I was 15 or 20. And so, I don't mean to sound too Pollyanna about it, but I really do have a lot of faith in the clarity of vision that I'm seeing in young organizers.
Thank you. Rebecca, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, everything that Debasri said is so powerful and true. I have seen things change in my lifetime. I complained about the Democratic Party's passivity and even support at various periods for Hyde. But then you can look at the recent history around the Democratic Party and Hyde and see reasons for hope. You had young organizers from a reproductive justice movement, young people of color working with a group called All Above All, who were organizing across the country for years to oppose Hyde, and they found purchase with the great Congresswoman Barbara Lee in California, and in 2015 she put the Each Woman Act out, and it was opposition to Hyde, and then Hillary Clinton in 2016 made opposition to Hyde part of her campaign in the Democratic primary, and then it wound up in the Democratic platform that year. And just this past year, Joe Biden, who himself had supported Hyde early in his career and had been anti-abortion, included a budget that opposed Hyde, right? So we have seen this shift. We've seen things get better. And I also think in terms of the long haul thing, that I think people can hear now and feel like daunted that this is not actually going to be fixed in our lifetimes. And rather than be daunted, I think it was error and a kind of historical deprivation for the couple of generations that existed after the big wins, again, not just around abortion, but around civil rights, voting rights, labor rights, that there was this attitude that we could be done with this and that we didn't have to worry about it anymore. And not only was that error strategically, it also took away the history and the pride. There were generations, including mine, that wasn't really taught about the generations that had worked in order to make those victories possible, because we wanted to just pretend that they were fixed now instead of they were still living, breathing, and we needed to improve upon them, right? And now that has been stripped. There's no question that paralysis will have to be gone. But I think it's a proud and inspiring inheritance to become reacquainted with that history of the people who worked their lives for a more just and equal world, and to understand that we are stepping in after a very bad pause, right? But that we are stepping back into that work, understanding that we're undertaking something that our kids are also going to be working on through their lives. And it is terrifying, and there are going to be people who suffer, and I don't want to make it pretty, but it is also a proud and righteous past that we should embrace as we look forward and understand that this is going to be the work of our future.
Yes, absolutely. We could not end any better way. I want to thank you so much for this insightful conversation. We almost made it through the whole thing without my children running in the room, but they did during you talking, Rebecca, so I'm sorry for that at the very end. But I'm now going to turn the program over to Taya, and I just want to say thank you all so much again. Your work is incredible. It's changing the lives of so many people, and I'm really honored to be here with you this evening, so thank you.
Thank you so much for being a part of this. So just on behalf of everyone at Type, thank you all for joining us. Thanks to Gladys and Neil for being such steadfast champions of journalism in the public interest. Thank you to my dear colleague, Christine Brooke, who has made so much of this evening possible, and to the team at Garwood Events. And thank you all for joining us, for watching and being a part of this evening. I hope you'll consider making a donation to Type in support of a free and independent journalism that we do. We need your help now more than ever. I'm just really grateful to everyone for being a part of this. Hopefully, if it's it's safe to do so. We will see you all in person later in 2022 for the Puffin celebration at the end of the year. So again, thank you all for being a part of this, and have a good evening. Take care, everybody.